Now you understand how deployment can be scaled and also learn a few useful kubectl commands along the way, and also how to record kubectl commands. As a next step, let's actually test that nginx application is really accessible through its service and see how we can talk to it. For that, we're going to deploy another pod in the cluster, and we're going to do a simple curl to our nginx application's service. So this is going to be basically a test pod that we're just going to deploy temporarily in order to test that accessing nginx application through its service actually works. So we're going to do a simple curl command from inside the pod. And this means we don't need a deployment configuration file for it. We just want to quickly create a pod, test it, and then we can remove it up to that. So we're going to create that pod using an imperative kubectl run command. So let's do kubectl run, and let's call this pod test nginx service. And we're going to need an image, which is a required attribute because each pod has to have at least one container based on some image. And we can actually use the same nginx image because nginx image has curl pre-installed, and that's what we need. And let's execute. So this should actually start a pod called test nginx service. And remember, this doesn't have a deployment behind it. It's purely a pod on its own. Now the pod is running, but how do we execute commands from inside the pod? Because that's what we want, right? We don't want to execute a curl command from the node. We want to enter the terminal of the pod or environment of the pod, because pod is part of the pod network in the cluster. And the nginx service that we have can only be accessed from within the cluster. So how do we get into the pod's terminal? Well, there is an own command for that, which is kubectl exec command. And this lets us execute commands inside the pod. And one option we have to specify here is IT, which stands for interactive terminal. So we're getting an interactive terminal of the pod with the name test nginx service. And then we have to pass that exec command a Linux command for the pod, which is going to be bash. So we're executing a bash command inside this pod, which will give us an interactive terminal of that pod. So if I execute this, you see it changed to the pod's environment. So I'm no longer on the master node anymore. I am inside the test nginx service pod as a root user, as you see right here. And I'm seeing the virtual file system of the pod. And this is actually a great way to debug your applications by entering the pod and accessing its file system, maybe if you want to check some configurations or execute commands, etc. And if you want to leave the pod environment and move back to the node, you can simply do exit, and that's going to be it. So in this case, we want to again enter the pod test nginx service and execute curl command to the nginx applications service. So first of all, let's do kubectl get service. This will give us the name of the service and its IP address. And let's curl that from within the pod. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the IP address. So let's do HTTP, the IP address. And remember, we configured the service to be accessible on port 8080. So I'm going to copy that and execute. And as you see, the service is accessible at its IP address at the port, and we get welcome to nginx. And now let's check that the service is also accessible using its name. Again, copy the name of the service, execute, and there you go. So we got the same welcome to nginx response when we connected to nginx using the service name. And that means that the name of the service was resolved to its IP address. Now, how does that actually work? So how does the pod know that whenever it tries to connect to this service, basically with this name, it should connect to this IP address? So how does this resolution actually work in Kubernetes? And that's going to be the topic of our next lecture.